Welcome to the Legal Leaders Podcast, brought to you by LawVu, LawVu's community for in-house legal professionals, where we dive into the heart of the legal profession to bring you unfiltered discussions with industry titans on a broad spectrum of topics.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Legal Leaders Podcast. I'm David Lancelot, your host, the CLO and EVP Advocacy at LawVu. And I have with me today, Craig Segal, who is the CLO and Global Procurement Officer at Hootsuite. Hi, Craig. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, David. So happy to be here. You and I have had a lot of conversations and just really excited to get into this kind of discussion.
Yeah, it's awesome to see you here again. First time we met, Craig, I think was maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, when I came to Vancouver, thanks to our good friend, Paula Pepin. And I got the opportunity to speak at your global legal team offsite in Vancouver, which was just tremendous fun.
Yeah, no, it was great having you. And I think we actually met a whole bunch of years back at a conference in a very sunny part of the world.
Oh, you're right.
You remember that?
Right.
Yeah. It must have been a lot of fun.
Yes, no, that was good. In Hawaii, I think it's fair to say. So, yeah. So we have known each other for a while, and it's great to have you on the show today, Craig, because I think, the purpose of the show is really to bring people who I think are role models for in-house legal leadership to showcase their careers, basically, and bring them to the attention of the wider in-house community so we can keep, I think, transforming and evolving the in-house profession into what it's going to be when everybody's operating in the way that you are and others who've been on the show. So I think, Craig, it'd be great if we could start with what, some of your background, why you got into law in the first place. I think that's really, really always interesting to get that piece of backstory.
Yeah, it's a really good kind of opening question. And I would say, I definitely didn't take the traditional path. I would say, in high school and, when you had a lot of individuals that were interested in going the legal route, they would take debating classes or actually law classes at the time, which my high school did offer. I didn't do any of those. And I actually started out, in undergrad economics background, quickly switched to psychology, which was probably a step in the right direction because I realized where I could probably get the highest marks, which actually helped me ultimately get into law school. And when I was finishing my undergrad, I was, thinking about what do I want to do at the time? Tech and the internet was kind of really taking off. I thought, well, you know what, maybe I want to be a developer or an engineer. But then I was like, well, math isn't exactly my strong point, and haven't met a ton of engineers and developers that are, that aren't very strong on the math front. So that wasn't really an option. And kind of started doing some, research and speaking to individuals, and happened to know, various lawyers who were friends of the family. And, I thought it'd be interesting. I thought, hey, maybe at some point in time I could actually kind of blend the legal with the tech aspect of things, because I was always into kind of tech and playing around with the net. So, it wasn't really the traditional, I was born to be a lawyer and I, quote unquote, like arguing, and this is the route I want to take. I somehow really, honestly, I would say fell into it. But, looking back, I would say, going from economics to psychology helped psychology, understanding people. A lot of what I do today is really kind of in that realm of more being people-centric. So it was that journey, not traditional, but ultimately ended up being a lawyer.
Yeah, no, and as I said, I think that piece of backstory to me is always really fascinating because, as you say, like the skills that you pick up in those things that are not, the traditional legal path, I guess you could call them, like psychology and people skills, end up often being some of the most valuable ones that you have later in your career. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I think we should probably tell people, obviously Hootsuite is a Canadian company, originally Canadian. It's an international company now. And you're coming today from Toronto, right?
Yeah, I'm in Toronto. Spent a lot of time in Vancouver, where our headquarters is. But yeah, I'm in Toronto right now.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And so you went to law school in Toronto, and then did you start your legal career in Toronto as well?
Yeah, I've always been in Toronto. Started off my career in private practice, kind of the traditional route. Spent about 6 years in private practice. Really kind of at the time it started off as I thought I was actually going into the corporate function at the law firm, and I think the first day they said, "Hey, you're doing bankruptcy and insolvency." Which actually again kind of connecting the dots when you kind of think about you know what happened in the past, I mean, was probably the best thing for me because the insolvency route was very broad. You're involved in a lot of different companies, a lot of different aspects to it, and really got a broad range of a view of the legal and legal issues that arise in a whole bunch of different aspects. So there was a lot of corporate, a lot of M&A, banking, financing work, but I would say kind of connecting those dots, it really helped kind of kickstart my journey of being more of a generalist and a jack of all trades and, maybe a master of none. But that was, really a pivotal point in my career. So that's where I started off, spent 6 years there, and then decided at the right juncture, you know what, I wanted to be part of a company and really kind of thought my skill set and where I was at could land well from that perspective versus the staying in private practice.
Right on. Yeah. And it strikes me that kind of practice, that bankruptcy practice, is a bit like being a consultant at one of the big finance consultancies where you're going into all these different businesses and providing basically finance consulting, right? Um,
Yeah, it was a lot broader than even kind of legal. You're getting into a lot of the finance piece working. Obviously, that's a big factor in any insolvency and bankruptcy proceedings. And then obviously you have the dynamics of distressed companies and a shifting culture and changes within the organization. So you're wearing multiple hats, and it
sure.
really helped to at least kickstart my journey in terms of being successful in house.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think that's exactly why I think this podcast is useful, right? Because I there are so many routes to in-house, and you don't often think to say to law students, "Hey, if you wanted to build up great experience in business, go the bankruptcy route," right? I've had so many other journeys, speaking to GCs and CLOs, but I think that's a fascinating one and a really valuable learning. So you're in a law firm in Toronto, and somehow an in-house opportunity comes along. I'm always interested to hear like how it comes on your plate. You're thinking you want to, I assume, get closer to the business. How did that come around, and how did you make the decision to go in-house, and where?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the firm that I started at initially, which I was at for 4 years, great firm, great experience. Ultimately, maybe they would disagree, but I think that I probably would have ultimately been on a partnership track. And at that particular time, I was, itching and figuring out what do I want to do next. And I did start to kind of, kick the can or the tires, so to speak, in terms of, going in house. And it just so happened then an opportunity came up at a different firm, and focusing more on kind of the banking and the financing side. I would say probably, and this is a good lesson for my younger self, is kind of go with your gut, because at that particular time I was really wanted to go in house, but thought this would be a good experience. I didn't really love the financing and the banking work, but thought, hey, you know what? It will be something that I'll kind of grow to love. Well, I actually was something that I grew to hate. Um, and quickly realized that sifting through paper and doing diligence and doing things within a bubble just wasn't my jam. So shortly after, I decided it was time now to really kind of focus on moving in house. That was around I think around 2006. Around, the economy was booming, and there were jobs that were just available. So ultimately, I ended up moving to Canon, the camera company, which was, I would say, again, and I keep using this phrase, kind of connecting the dots, because you can only kind of connect them going backwards. I think Steve Jobs, who I watched a podcast, that's something that he said, was definitely the right move. Just to kind of get that grounding from a generalist moving in house, and kind of cutting your teeth. So that was my journey. But at the point in time when I knew I wanted to leave private practice, it was time to leave private practice.
Right on. And then, so at Canon, I mean, everybody knows Canon, right? Significant business. So I assume this is their Canadian operation that's based in Mississauga.
Yeah, exactly. So it's essentially it was Canon Canada, which is essentially a sub of Canon USA, and then obviously part of the global org. So the great part is being, really getting a flavor of kind of global operations, and brand obviously was extremely important. So you're thinking through everything from brand protection, and just the wide array of different initiatives, and issues that kind of come up in that kind of an organization. The good thing at Canon, there was obviously, they had hit move from analog to digital, and then there was a lot of kind of what else can we do. So there were a lot of different business initiatives in terms of looking at expanding out of kind of the core scope of their main focus of business, which allowed for different initiatives with the business units thinking out of the box, doing things for a first time in the Canadian market, which kind of really ended up being an interesting opportunity, which was fantastic.
Darn. And so is it fair to say that they brought you in as a generalist?
For sure, a generalist. And the funniest part is, I came in as a generalist, and I'll never forget this. My very first, call it, matter that I was involved in was actually an insolvency matter, which I was, how do I, I'm trying to get away from this. And then I was like, well, this is kind of like second nature to me. So, it was interesting. And I was actually just speaking to one of the external lawyers that was involved, who I met at a function a couple of weeks ago, and we were laughing about it. But it's, so I cut my teeth on that, and that was one of the first initiatives, and that kind of got me going, because I knew what I was doing. But there was a ton of stuff that was just brand new, and just kind of learning as you go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you had the same experience, but my experience is that when you're in, a substantial subsidiary of an international business, it's almost like general counseling, within that company, right? You're like GC of a division almost. You have the full scope of work basically for the sub, which it gives you a level of experience that you wouldn't get, let's say, if you were in the main corporate, headquarters.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I mean, the nice thing was also is you could also leverage, obviously, a global team of lawyers at Canon. So there was a lot of leveraging. And the nice thing is for the most part, you weren't reinventing the wheel. So there was a lot of leveraging. And I, learned very early on in my career is to leverage your resources. And, people have seen it before, and sometimes obviously in the US, probably 10 times the scale. So, it's really kind of utilizing those resources to make sure that you're being, as efficient as possible, and ultimately also doing the right thing for the company and from a global perspective, because you can't just, often march to the beat of your own drum when you're part of a much bigger organization.
Indeed. I think the skill set of, and this is something that we used to, it was a very important part of recruiting at eBay, was understanding how to operate in a matrixed organization, the complexity of ensuring you loop in the tax and the whoever team, right, on the thing that you do. not something that you want to have to train people on as much. And I'm sure you picked that up at Canon, right? Japanese company, et cetera.
Yeah, you got to pick up, and those are the nuances, and you have to pick them up quickly. And you know, it wasn't always perfect. Sometimes, you know, I learned sometimes the hard way of, you know, you got to make sure that you're kind of thinking, you know, holistically and globally, and then locally, and then kind of making sure that you also are taking, you know, certain, you know, individuals and groups along the journey with you. And doing it at the forefront, and not at the back end, because at the back end it just never ultimately works. So those were some good lessons very early on.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I can remember the only time I forgot to loop in the tax team when we were setting up a business in Mexico. After that,
Hey,
I'd never forget again. Because as you say, doing it on the back end is not fun, right? Like, oops, we forgot to do all the tax things to set up the business. But it also, it strikes me that there's an element of that where you learn in those early days how important it is to build relationships and trust in advance, right? Instead of surprising people who don't know you. I
yeah,
imagine you had some of that too.
Yeah, it's relationships, I think, are the is probably the most important aspect of being successful. And I often tell, you know, my team, and I remind myself of this, is, you know, things aren't always going to go right. And there's going to be hurdles, and, you know, it's just the nature of what we do. We sometimes don't get it right, and we make mistakes, and those mistakes are often forgivable, and you can get past them if you built those relationships. And building the relationships is, you know, there's a trust element to it. There's the being proactive, and then there's simply just the, you know, providing time and space for individuals and to ultimately build those relationships. So, you know, it was a lot easier when we were in an office. Obviously, now in the remote world, it becomes more challenging, but, you know, it's all doable. But I think, you know, the cornerstone of being successful in any regard, you know, whether it's legal, and I would say legal in particular, because you know, let's be frank, we're not often the most loved group in any organization.
Yep.
Although certainly at Hootsuite, I hope we are certainly loved. But it's those relationships that ultimately work when things don't go well, and then also when you're in the trenches, it's a lot easier to work through things when you have built those relationships.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And I think it takes a level of sophistication in management and leadership to know to tell your people a good part of your role here, being a generalist in-house lawyer, or even one of the specialists, is literally having coffees with people as broadly as possible, right?
Absolutely, and I often say to my team, you know, in particular, let's say quarter end, year end, when the stresses are high, and there's a lot going on, and, you know, everyone has their metrics, and their initiatives that they want to succeed in, and that's the time to step up. Because that's the time when individuals remember that you were there by their side, you're being a help and not a hindrance, and that goes a long way. And I think it's there's certain junctures, crisis situations are very similar to,
Yep.
right, where, you know, that's the time to kind of step up. We should be stepping up every day, but the extra step up is in those instances where there's a lot of goodwill, and a lot of marketing that you can do, which is sometimes intangible, but it's those aspects that really come into play to be successful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Building trust, building accountability, and just as you say, building relationships. And I think there's a lot to having a background in psychology where, you know, some people aren't studying the fact that those things are tremendously important before they become lawyers, right? And I think it's a real failing of professional education, particularly in the United States, but, you know, I think probably everywhere, to to not even talk about, in most cases, those skills. that are so fundamental to success in any professional role, but particularly, as you say, in legal practice, where, and I'm sure you'd agree, we end up being this sort of spider web between all the different parts of the businesses, particularly in a complex international organization, and having the understanding that it's not just like somebody threw a ball to me, I got to do my thing and throw a ball to the next person.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if I'm not sure if things have changed, or hopefully they have changed. But I mean, when I was at law school, there were no courses, or even any courses about in-house. I think you're actually a part of a course now, as a prof, which is amazing. But then you get into even the law firm environment, right? And the law firm environment is, yeah, again, I'm not sure that much has probably changed. A lot of it's cutthroat. A lot of it is your own little island. Everyone's kind of fending for themselves, and it doesn't exactly blend into teamwork and collaboration, and how to kind of communicate with your fellow colleague, to make sure that ultimately you're all kind of rowing in the same direction. Now, obviously, I'm being maybe a bit extreme, but I think that it's just that plays into all of
You're
it, and then you
100%
jump,
right.
you jump in
100%.
house, and it's a totally different ball game. And again, not to disparage legal, but you are a bit on the back foot because you have to prove yourself, and you got to prove the value. And the way you do it is not simply just by churning red lines. And there's a lot of other intangibles that ultimately result in the team collectively being viewed as a value add.
I couldn't use you perfectly. I say those things, as you say. I teach this course at the University of Florida on in-house legal leadership, and that is absolutely one of the sort of talk tracks that I give the students, is this idea of going from law school to private practice, getting indoctrinated in this way of operating, and then moving in-house and wondering why no one wants to talk to you. Right? Especially if you continue to operate in the way that you were operating, the way you've been trained to operate. But even if you are trying to be a business person with legal skills and try to integrate with the business, they still have this perception, probably because they've dealt with lawyers in the past who weren't operating that way. Maybe they were external, but maybe they were internal. It didn't really understand, how to be successful in house. So you've got to overcome so many things. It's a really, really challenging situation. And that's, from my perspective, like starting with the students, but then also speaking to as many people and as many teams as possible, so we can, as relative, I think I'm feeling pretty experienced these days, right? Like, I think we could say we were pretty experienced legal leaders, right? Being able to say there is a way to do this that works, that is productive and positive and effective. And let's just continue to sort of pay it forward after having, battled our way through that. I don't know what to call it. The sort of barriers that we create for ourselves as a profession. Yeah. So let's move forward in your career, Craig. You've learned a lot at Canon. Obviously, I would love to have worked for a Japanese business at some point in my career. I haven't yet, but I think Japanese culture and everything fascinating. You move on. Tell us about next steps after that.
Yeah, so Canon was 6 years. It was really an amazing experience. But I got to the point in time that I wanted to run my own show. I also wanted to be at the quote unquote mothership versus a subsidiary of a much large organization. And an opportunity came up in a Toronto-based technology company that played in the data visualization space. They had hit a home run a number of years before I joined, where they did a sale of a whole bunch of assets to Microsoft, and this was their second kick at it. And that was really an amazing experience, because that was moving from Canon, I wouldn't consider as a kind of pure tech player. Obviously, a lot of the technology is being created in Japan and then flows down to the subsidiaries, and moving to pure kind of software tech, and being at the mothership being a part of an executive team, at a smaller organization than Hootsuite was a really good stepping stone for me. It was an incredible experience. A lot of the different issues that you deal with in tech, startup-ish, software, SaaS, really kind of helped me again, on my journey to ultimately end up at Hootsuite. So spent four years at that company, and then an opportunity came up at Hootsuite. I wasn't at the time looking. I was happy where I was at. I was running the show, which I liked, and I think the story that our good friend Paula Pepin. I met her at a dinner. For some reason, she thought that maybe I had some skills in terms of coming in and helping the commercial side of the business at Hootsuite. And the conversation started, and there were a lot of things that I loved. I love the Hootsuite story. I love the scale of Hootsuite, Canadian tech darling. Obviously, working with Paula was a plus, but then it was kind of a bit of a step back in terms of not running the show. And I decided to take the leap and join Hootsuite. I never actually joined with the idea of becoming the GC or CLO, and essentially came in to help streamline and fix a whole bunch of different issues that had arisen on the commercial and the GRO side of the business, and came in and did that. So that's where my journey started at Hootsuite, which is now 8 years ago, which I cannot believe because time flies.
Totally.
And that was it was, I've made some good decisions in my life, and I made some bad. I would say this was definitely one of the best decisions that I've made. And there certainly was some risk involved, and I was obviously gaining and then losing in certain aspects, but came in and luckily enough, and this is, there's certain things in one's career that kind of helps you propel your career. It just so happened that there was a sales individual at the time who took a liking to me, and I would say a liking based on the skills that I brought and maybe the way I approached things, and obviously ultimately didn't view me as a hurdle to closing business, and really kind of put me on what I would call, and maybe not a justified at the time, a pedestal in terms of the skills that I could bring. But that ultimately gave me wind under my wings, and continued on the journey, and really helped try to streamline and create efficiencies in that function within the department, and ultimately be viewed as a value add and not a hurdle, and enabling the business and all that other kind of stuff. So that was really kind of my journey, and I never came to Hootsuite with this idea of being the chief legal officer. And if you had asked me when I joined Hootsuite if that was ever in the cards, or if I ever thought that was going to be the case, and Paula can attest to this, it was never in the cards. And it just so happened that Paula decided that it was her time to move on. And, I like to say this, and I truly believe it, is that Paula believed in me at the time more than I probably believed in myself in terms of the skills and what I could bring to the table. And I ultimately took over as CLO, and here I am.
Fantastic. So there's two things at least two things there, threads I want to pull on. One is Hootsuite, the business. I think most people know what Hootsuite is, but I think it's worth giving some background on the Canadian tech business that is Hootsuite.
Sure.
For our international audience.
For sure. So, Hootsuite really kind of, I would say, created the social media management space. So essentially what Hootsuite does is helps companies, and, everything from call it, solo to mid to enterprise companies, manage their social in terms of, the basic in terms of publishing. And it gets really complex, because if you think about very large organizations, they would have hundreds or thousands of different social channels. And, so it helps with publishing, scheduling, different kinds of campaigns. And then there's also obviously listening capabilities and being able to understand what's happening from a brand sentiment perspective, and then blending kind of everything into one. So it's a full kind of social media management platform that helps manage one's social needs. Obviously, social in terms of from a marketing perspective is probably, I would say, probably taken over traditional marketing and advertising, and this is where it's all at. So
Yep.
it's really it's an interesting space. And then there's essentially also performance marketing, which gets into lead attribution and being able to kind of see what's happening on social to ultimately drive leads and create to create revenue. So it's gone, it's really morphed, and the entire obviously social journey and marketing has matured, and Hootsuite has been on the journey. Global organization, hundreds of thousands of customers, and really have been a part of this journey with social, and seeing it mature, or sometimes one would say maybe not maturing from a social perspective, depending on how you look at it. But it makes for a really exciting and interesting space to play in.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you guys have like actual formal offices around the world, like with humans in offices?
Yeah, we do. So we actually have, I believe, around 16 different actual physical offices around the world.
Wow.
So we do have those physical offices. Obviously, after COVID, lucky enough, we do have a flexible remote working type of environment. We do have what we call perch days, where certain groups will come in on certain days. It's not mandatory, so it's wherever one's going to be the most productive and the most effective. Do as you wish. But we do have physical offices in a large part of the countries that we're operating in.
Yeah. And I mean, you probably say you operate in all countries of the world, right? Aside from the sanctioned ones. Um, but do you have like particular markets that you'd say are Hootsuite, you spend a lot of time thinking about from a legal perspective and a business perspective?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we do a huge amount of business in North America, and then obviously we have a large and a big presence in Europe.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of and then obviously in Asia as well. And I would say the different landscapes and the different regions certainly have their own interesting intricacies and different regulations. Obviously, Europe is from a whole bunch of different perspectives, where privacy or data and GDPR and just a whole bunch of different kinds of regulations that one needs to navigate, different employee issues and jurisdictional intricacies that one needs to kind of work through. So, I would
Yeah.
say one needs to look at obviously all the regions and make sure that we are compliant in a whole bunch of different regions. Some you need to kind of focus on more than others, but it's a matter of taking sometimes a different lens in the various jurisdictions. And that's not even just from the compliance perspective, right? I mean, the way business is done in North America versus, let's say, Europe, and some of the checks and balances and some of the compliance items is very different. And you can't just try and duplicate the way business is done, or the way you kind of look at things from, let's say, a legal compliance perspective in the Americas versus Europe. It just doesn't work. So there's got to be flexibility. Obviously, you need to scale, but you need to look at it from different lenses for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I, both in this class that I teach, but also in just like discussions with GCs, I have a list of mistakes that I've made from a cultural perspective, because it's just challenging to go into an environment. You go into Austria versus Argentina versus Australia, and they may all start with an A, but they're completely different business environments. And I think the most fascinating one for me is often the legal cultural environment of a country, where dealing with a Mexican lawyer is a much more formal situation than dealing with a U.S. based person or a Canadian based person. But then you go to Austria and it's so easy to trip up on the fact that, doctor, somebody isn't being treated with the right level of respect in their, communications and all that kind of thing. So I think that a really fascinating aspect of international practice that we could probably spend all day talking about. I wanted though to talk about how you have and I'm not sure if you would say you had this back in your previous role at Dundas, or this is something that came about at Hootsuite, or maybe you had this through your whole in-house career, but a mixed legal and almost pure business role, right? Because you are both the CLO and the global procurement officer. Could you tell us about how you got into that and how you feel about, operating in that space as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it started off with, I kind of look at myself as a business-minded lawyer. I like to use that term. I like to use, I'm practical. I wear, I wear this and simply just say, crossing T's and dotting I's. It's important, but that doesn't make me wake up in the morning and get me excited. I like to look at things from a business perspective. And, the fortunate part of being in legal, and I think you kind of, mentioned this earlier on, is you kind of see the big picture.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of being able to, you see the big picture, and then you also got to be practical. And, being practical means that sometimes there needs to be a risk tolerance, and you cannot see the world in, black and white. You need to see kind of gray, and you need to be able to speak business speak. And ultimately, I would say my journey was, I was, at Dundas, I was fortunate enough to take on additional roles other than the pure legal function, which was a really great experience because you really kind of get to, speak like a business person, think about metrics, think about how a objective criteria versus what often happens in legal, which I think things are changing, and we can get to that in a bit. But where it's not, you're not just getting away with the subjective. Well, I'm protecting the company, so it worked for me in terms of my skill set. And again, I think that one of my strengths is being a people person, and ultimately you need to work with a team and work cross functionally and all of that other kind of stuff. And then at Hootsuite, the procurement rolls up into legal, where it's a really great fit and great synergies. And it's a matter of just thinking about things certainly from a risk perspective. When I talk about risk on the procurement side, it's more how much are you actually paying, what are you paying, and then obviously the commercial terms within an agreement. But then it's looking at the whole broader picture of, for example, obviously most companies want to be profitable. Fortunately, Hootsuite is profitable, and we absolutely want to continue on that journey and exponentially grow that profitability. And the way to do it is certainly through procurement. The other aspect of it is, again, and I don't want to kind of keep harping on this, but lawyers and showing the value, you're often looked at as a cost center. Being able to pivot into something else where you can actually show, hey, listen, yes, there's the legal aspect and it's super important, but now there's this other aspect that you might have under your belt where you can show, hey, what are the cost savings that are occurring? What are you consolidating? What are you cutting out? What can you show from an impact from an EBITDA perspective, which really goes a long way. And that's where the business really ultimately focuses on. You go to the business and you talk about wonderful red lines that you've done in an indemnity agreement, and they roll their eyes and fall asleep. You go and you say, hey, listen, I just saved you $1 million on a contract. And guess what that's going to do to, from an EBITDA perspective, and all of a sudden there's shining eyes, and there's a lot of time and space being provided. So I think it's important for most lawyers, if they have the inclination and the ability, to try and pivot. And it's not an easy pivot, and it's not easy to often transition, because legal even today is still looked at as, boxed in and certain skill set, which I think is wrong. But I think it's a matter of individuals to make the play and to show the business that these are the skills that one has, where they can actually, you can be more of far more benefit doing a lot more than simply just say the legal function. And I'm not taking away from the importance of the legal function. Obviously, my ultimate role is as chief legal officer is to protect the company and its stakeholders. But there's a whole other piece where you can show value.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree more, of course. And I think it's wonderful to hear about procurement and legal working hand in hand. Because I think there can sometimes be some friction between this idea of, a focus on the commercial aspects, I guess you'd call it, of a deal, and a focus on what we think of as the legal aspects of a deal, and which one is more important, and who's better at doing deals and all that kind of thing. So, but bringing them together, I think we as in-house lawyers, we have a ton to learn from procurement on basically our job, right? Getting deals done, creating persuasive narratives that get to the result that the business is looking for from a strategic perspective. So I think it's wonderful to hear that. And then
there's also metrics.
I
mean, there's also sorry to interrupt, but there's also metrics,
Yep.
which obviously procurement is, it's pretty objective in terms of the metrics that they're targeting and whether you're hitting those metrics and the KPIs or not. And then I would say, David, there's an intangible. Anytime I need any legal tech, that's been pushed through pretty quickly, right? So you got to think about all of the benefits in this, right?
100%. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I've been actually surprised in the role that I'm in now to see how, as lawyers, as in-house lawyers, we do deals all day long, right? We do contracting and deals all day long. But when you talk to an in-house lawyer and often a leader, they sometimes don't really understand how the procurement process that they're so deeply involved in and important in works, right? They're used to doing sort of a portion of that process as opposed to seeing the entire process, or they don't feel, maybe they don't empathize with the business customers who have to go through that process on a regular basis and understand how painful it can be sometimes to go and get, InfoSec approval for something, and also privacy approval for something, and also legal approval for something, and the steps and the system and all of that. So they're used to dropping in over here, but not understanding, like, we could do this whole thing a lot better. And even down to like budgeting, right? Like knowing that there's a budget line for certain things that you don't normally use. And then when you show up and say, hey, I need some of this budget to go here, like how that works, the whole process is, I often tell people this when I'm doing talks, like learning about that process and really owning it as soon as possible before you need to use it, right? Before you need to.
And if we're talking about even transferable skills, I can tell you that in terms of kind of all the skills or, all of the ingredients that I used on the legal side, in terms of, showing the benefit and the value, and ultimately, having a legal department that is viewed as a value add, I duplicated that, I would say, on the procurement side. In terms of, what's important is again, building relationships, stakeholder engagement. To your point, understanding what, there's processes, but you also can't get bogged down in processes and bureaucracy. You have a business to run, but it's ultimately kind of threading that needle in terms of finding the efficiencies that you can, and ultimately, and then enablement. I mean, enablement on the legal side and business, understanding what is legal's role, what is the role of the business, how do you operate best together. I mean, that's self-evident obviously on the commercial and the GRO side of the business, where there's a lot of interdependencies in terms of the working relationship and making sure it works well. No different than on the procurement side, where, a lot of it is enablement, understanding what is procurement's role, what is the business stakeholders' role in, call it a, net new purchase, or, strategic consolidation of software or whatnot, and then ultimately knowing how that works best. So a lot of the skills that I used in the one area, I've transferred it to another. Often, sometimes don't get it right, but and certainly skills I'm still building, but definitely the ones that I think have worked for me, I try and duplicate.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and it's really, I mean, anybody listening to this is going to think this too. I think you're speaking the language of the business, right? when you're accessing and mastering, I guess, that skill set of, as you said, metrics, operating as a business person with legal skills, deep into the what's the value of what we're bringing to the table. You're speaking the language of the business, and that's, I think, one of the key differentiators for the modern, effective in-house lawyer is knowing that that is how you get stuff done. Right? And it could be a super esoteric legal matter, but you got to use this language to get that taken care of. If you go esoteric legal on business people in any situation, that's, as you said, that's when they're like, good night, good night. Because, in the old days, we used to be able to say, oh, this is scary. You wouldn't understand. Give me more money. And those days are way over. Right. I don't know anybody, particularly in North America and maybe, the UK, Australia, where that line works anymore.
Yeah, that gets back to, that gets to the basics of the benefit of having an in-house legal department, right? Because you really are that bridge, right? You go to external, and for the most part, I'm generally very cautious of when I bring my external advisors in relative to face-to-face meetings with my business units. Not because I'm trying to protect my turf. It's not that at all. It's just, it's the speak, and it's the approach, and it's the benefit that we can bring is being that bridge of, getting sometimes obviously you need the expert advice, you need the guidance, which is extremely important from external, but then it's kind of deciphering and then taking it down to a level that the business side again is not going to fall asleep, because that's not going to be any help. And ultimately getting to where you need to get to is outline what the issues are and what is to solve, and how do you mitigate and all that other kind of stuff, and all being on the same page. So it just gets back to the real benefit that obviously in-house can bring.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's great that you were able to so easily speak about that, right? Because I think it's one of the critical questions about in-house practice. Like, what is the purpose of the function? Why are we even here, right? And if you have somebody, and this is why you're here, Craig, because I want people to listen to you say that and go, now I can say that too, right? Here's somebody who's got a ton of experience, is super successful, has got this, profile on the stage, and he's saying it that way. I'm going to say it that way too. And I think, lucky for your team, right? And for your business that they're able to see that and hear that. I think a lot of times in-house lawyers are unable to, justify the value, justify the purpose of the in-house function, but it's absolutely that. And then I think the other thread there that I love talking about is how different the in-house profession is now from the private practice profession, right? I think 20 years ago when we both started, they were very similar. There was a very similar role to be played. And now I feel like they're very different professions.
I think it's day and night, right? In terms of kind of what you're moving from kind of legal advisors to strategic advisors. I think obviously, having a seat at the exec table, which, I still, a lot of colleagues that I speak to at the GC and the CLO level who don't have that, I think is problematic in a whole bunch of respects. Obviously, there's different journeys of companies and different sizes of exec teams, but I think it's so, that just gets into kind of being able to, first of all, understand what's going on in the business. Second of all, having a seat at the table, and being able to, when you do need to advocate your positions to have, have a voice that's gonna be heard. So I think there's definitely a whole change that is occurring in the industry. I mean, I would say, and this might be a little bit controversial, but it kind of gets into a little bit of what we're talking about, and I don't shy away from controversy, but I would say even the reporting lines, right? I mean, I think years ago, a lot of times the reporting line was, GC, CLO to CFO. That I think has changed or changing. I think, from at least my perspective, and this is where I'm going to go out on the limb and might reduce my job opportunities if any CFO might actually want to hire me. But I think, CLO and GC should be reporting to a CEO. Obviously, it depends on the type and the size of an organization and reporting lines. But I think it kind of plays into the value add and the changes that are occurring in the house, uh, and not just being seen as a pure cost center and a compliance function, which maybe fits somewhat well under the CFO umbrella, versus when you're reporting into the CEO, and then obviously there's a line to a degree to the board, and looking at it from that perspective, and I think that's a shift that is occurring and is certainly occurring. I don't think we're there yet, because a lot of colleagues I do speak to still have the I don't sit on the executive. I don't know what's going on. I'm fortunate that I have a seat at the table, and it's just so I've seen both sides of it, and it's just, to your point, I think these are the things that are changing. We still have ways to go, but I think everyone, I think it's important for everyone in house who's in those positions to, first of all, speak and have a good argument in terms of when one makes the play of why it makes sense to be reporting into, let's say, the CEO versus COO or CFO. Again, organizations are different and reporting lines are different. So I'm not saying there's, one shoe size fits all, so to speak. But these are all the things that are morphing and changing.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. No, and I think the profession has, over the past 25, probably 30 years, gone through a pretty dramatic transformation, but we're still considerably behind the other functions in terms of, I mean, pretty much everything. Uh, I like to talk about back office bean counters sometimes. I mean, we may be old enough now to remember when the finance people were the back office bean counters, who, you know, don't want that finance guy in the room. He's just going to talk about numbers, right? And put the spreadsheet up. Sometimes they still do that, to be fair, right? Sometimes it's quite a lot of spreadsheets, but and nobody now would say, "Oh, we can't have the CFO in the room or the CFO on the leadership team," right? The CFO is often the CEO in waiting, and I think you see the same journey with HR, right? Like at least 10 years ago, they're sort of back office doing that HR stuff. Now, most times they're right there at the table, right? And I think we're, as a function, we're in a similar kind of arc. And some people, and more, right, that you encounter are in-house professionals who are able to sit at that table like you do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I agree with you. I think it's definitely a journey. I think we still have a ways to go, but I think I think it's incumbent upon kind of all of us in house to be shifting and to doing what is going to actually help our cause versus kind of staying in that box, right? And it kind of starts off with the and I think I might have mentioned this earlier of we could often get away in the past with the subjective. Well, we're a compliance function. There's no way to measure. There's no way to we're protecting the company. There haven't been any lawsuits. We haven't hit the newspaper. So guess what? I guess we're doing our job, right? And I think one needs to look at it from the business mindset of there are metrics, and I can tell you that's the way to show value, and it's a different mindset. And I'll be frank, I struggled with it for a long time in terms of different iterations of different leaders pushing metrics and KPIs and OKRs, and try to kind of fit that square peg in the round hole. And if you really think about it and you do it well and you look at the company strategy, there are ways to come up with metrics that can move the needle, that can benefit the business, show your objective value to the business. And that's when you start being viewed as, hey, a business function versus your, cost center, be on the side, we'll call you when we need you kind of thing, versus an integral part of just one business unit, no different than another. So there's a lot that we can do to shift that sentiment.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree more, of course, Craig. And I talk about using quantitative and qualitative information to create persuasive narratives, right? And you'd think that as lawyers, we would be pretty good at that, right? That's basically our job is to convince people of things, right? Whether it's sign this contract in the way it is, or, regulator, go away today, come back another day. But we just aren't taught to do that. We aren't taught to do that at every level in-house, from junior all the way to the most senior people. And some of the most productive and engaging conversations I have are with GCs, where we work on taking metrics and sort of massaging them and visualizing them against strategic objectives, right, from the business, and aligning them so that they can go into those rooms in the way that you do, and talk about, here's the value of legal, right? This is the impact that we're having in the language of the business. So
Yeah,
I think that's,
yeah, and it's so important to also, focus on, again, metrics that matter. And again, metrics that can tie to the corporate strategy. And, I think oftentimes when I first started out, it was like, quantity over quality. In other words, I'm going to show all of these different metrics, and this is showing my value. Versus, I can tell you, we're going through a metrics exercise right now, and right now we have 2 metrics that we're looking at that are very tied to a corporate objective. And that's where we've kind of honed it. So, that doesn't mean to say that there aren't other metrics that are important that will help drive, the department forwards, but it's a matter of finding kind of those metrics that matter. And then it's also, sometimes, and again, this gets into, some of if there's a misunderstanding of what legal does. And then, you can go down rabbit holes in terms of, the business pushing metrics that simply just don't make sense. If I don't have an SLA issue from churning contracts, let's say, I don't need an SLA, a metric on SLAs. Like that's not what is going to drive, deals to close quicker. So I think it's also a matter of being able to advocate what metrics work. And again, what metrics just don't make sense, but it's a matter of being able to back that up. Not just saying, well, this doesn't work because I don't want to track it, or I'm not able to track it. Some of the metrics just don't make sense for a particular department or where a company might be at, or, just in terms of what we do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't have put it better myself. Absolutely. Well, Craig, I think that's a bit of a masterclass on in-house legal leadership. I really appreciate you spending the time to talk to us today. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you again. I'm not sure where we'll meet up in the world, but I'm sure we will. So thanks for being with us. And this has been the Legal Leaders Podcast, brought to you by LawVu. See you next time.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks,
Appreciate the time and great chat. Thanks.
Awesome. See you soon, mate.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed listening, please hit follow and leave us a review on your listening platform of choice. We love engaging with our community and hearing from you, so please head to inview.lawvu.com. Thank you so much for tuning in.